You've probably heard of something called eugenics, the science of improving humans through artificial selection. What role did this pseudoscience play in the evolution of racism, and where did it originate? Under what political regime did it reach its final development, and where does it reside now? Let's answer all these questions. The origins of racial theories can be traced back to the very concept of eugenics, which is essentially a form of selective breeding. While the term eugenics implies working towards improving the heredity of plants and animals, eugenics specifically refers to the same process applied to human nature. According to some scholars, humans are also animals, but in the humanities we are seen as something separate and spiritual. Major world religions also belong to these spheres that separate the highest creation from the rest of its creatures. However, for biologists, humans are simply the highest primates, or hominids, with monkeys belonging to the middle primates, and lemurs, tarsiers, and galagos belonging to the lower primates. The teachings of Charles Darwin, along with those of his cousin Francis Galton, introduced the concept of natural selection, which improved and shaped humans into their modern form. However, this concept of natural selection was discovered long before the British scientists Darwin and Galton. It was first discovered not in Britain but in France, where the first Russian theories on the subject also originated. So it is unfair to blame the Germans for the birth of the scientifically backed idea of segregation. They were actually third after the French and the thinkers of the United Kingdom. One of the earliest proponents of the idea of natural selection was Charles Montesquieu, who, in the first half of the 18th century, stated that the number of species multiplies naturally to produce higher quality offspring. This was during the Age of Enlightenment in Europe, a time that was very conducive to distant scientific thought. It was a time when the authority of the classical Western Christian religion was slowly being challenged by its own believers, and the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century, who were often non-believers. Walter, or Montesquieu, and Darwin built upon the foundations laid by the French God-fighters of the 19th century. Among them was Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin, who, in 1883, combined his 20 years of work in anthropology into a separate science, which he named eugenics, derived from the Greek words eu, meaning good or ideal, and genos, meaning born or race. The name eugenics literally translates to noble in Greek, and the ancient Spartans would throw infants off a cliff if they were not considered eugenic. Specialists in eugenics seek to understand how to produce eugenic individuals, and many have been attracted to this idea. While some had previously suspected it, the scientific evidence provided in the late 19th century confirmed it. The French treatise by Gobineau, which will be discussed later, justified the evolutionary idealism of humans. He compared civilizations from all parts of the earth, not on a biological level, but on a humanitarian one. At the core of Galton's teachings was the unshakable belief that human intellect can be passed down to offspring, meaning that intelligence, critical thinking, and the drive for knowledge are inherited traits. Francis merely proved the fact of transmission, while his followers combined intellect as a sign of having white skin and the right facial features. Thus, classical eugenics merely justified the appearance of mental abilities as a consequence of natural selection in the human environment, leading to two different directions of development. One half of classical eugenics continued to study inherited human traits, linking them to various factors, except for genetic diseases, genetic external features in terms of congenital disabilities, genetic predispositions to the lifestyle of parents, even to pregnancy violations, and the influence of climate on heredity. At the same time, the wise men, having read the works of Gobineau, who, let us repeat, created his works even earlier than Darwin and Galton, gave birth to their own eugenics, which is now called negative. But at the end of the 19th century, it was something particularly advanced in the Western scientific world. Most importantly, it satisfied the policies of colonial empires. In 1860, the world's leading metropolitan areas reached the highest number of their colonies. Negative eugenics, which suggested that the ability to reproduce should be taken away from the worst humans, gained traction among the leading colonial powers such as the British, French, Spanish, and Portuguese empires. These empires hinted at a very thick circumstance. It was time to somehow justify, in the eyes of society, the behavior of the superior race, the residents of these states and other Nordics towards the red-skinned Amerindians, the yellow-skinned Asians, and the black-skinned Equatorial Africans and Aboriginals. The recognition of these ideas by the highest scientific communities, which were directly funded by the gold from the colonies, further fueled the development of negative eugenics. In addition to positive eugenics, which was focused on finding a method to create a better human, negative eugenics aimed to prove that certain races, other than the Europid race, should be prevented from reproducing. By the end of the 19th century, even white people were being filtered out, with Nordics, Semites, Arabs, Jews, Hamites of North America, a small part of the population of Eastern Africa, and people from the southern half of Western Europe and some Mediterranean islands, who were lighter-skinned, being separated. Even before eugenics in 1811, the British Empire introduced a taboo on marriages with the mentally ill, while the French had similar practices in their colonies. The works of such hellish figures as the American Charles Davenport, the Briton America Fitzroy, and the Frenchman Georges de la Poujade, even in Italy, were ahead of their time. The British and French colonies covered all of Southern Asia and more than 90% of Africa, all of North America, except for the southernmost coasts, the territories originally belonging to Spain, Australia, New Zealand, and Oceania, and dozens of large and small tropical islands, especially in the Caribbean Sea, as well as Madagascar and a couple of territories in South America. As for the English, they sought to turn the once powerful Chinese Empire into a semi-colony where they could do whatever they wanted. Many did not know that even such famous writers as Jack London and Rudyard Kipling, in their youth, wrote poems and stories that exalted the white man above the rest of the world, claiming that he was more beautiful, braver, more decisive, more creative, more knowledgeable, and thus he created civilization. The Europeans of that period recognized the fruits of their own culture, and the Nordic was considered the ideal of beauty, a hint from the creator himself that the Nordics should support civilization. The composer Wagner exalted the common root of all Nordics, the ancient Germanic nobility in terms of customs, and everything was leading to one thing, the opening of chairs and then entire faculties of eugenics. The result of their activities was the covert sterilization of the indigenous population of the colonies and the half-breeds who were closer to the whites. The rest were poisoned with bromine, which made men infertile, in the water bodies, wells, and irrigation canals. In experimental lazarets, something was cut out of the men and women, explaining that these organs were the cause of all their diseases. Interestingly, before the First World War, in the missions, which were partly the same lazarets, the autochthonous population of the colonies was already being subjected to X-ray irradiation, an experiment that had two results: sterilization and the determination of the peculiarities of the impact of this newly discovered type of radiation on humans. This also applies to combat poison gases and vaccines. The government of at least one empire, the British, openly stated that it was clearing space in South Africa from the colonizers, from the Netherlands, the Boers, whom the English called Boeries. This people generally organized a hunt for the local black population, the tribes of the Xhosa and the Zulus. The Boers shot black people like simple beasts, and after the arrival of graduates from the faculties of eugenics and fans of Gobineau's books, the ranks of the Boers were joined by followers of the ideas of the irritated Nietzsche, who had long been waiting for the arrival of the supermen. Eugenics and the people who created it in Germany drew conclusions from negative eugenics and used it as the foundation of racism as a full-fledged doctrine, not just a form of everyday chauvinism in the colonies. This was done by Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, a French theorist who, in the 1850s, so fueled society's perception of eugenics, which, as a single coherent doctrine, did not yet exist. Gobineau developed his ideas before the emergence of Galton's teachings, and even during its development, and the basis was a hierarchy of three races: white, yellow, and black. The white race occupied the top step, the yellow race, or the Mongoloids, and the Amerinds occupied the middle step, and the black race occupied the lower step. In his opinion, only the civilization of the whites, in the new time, was stuck somewhere in the ancient and medieval world, while the yellow race was stuck in primitiveness. The proof of this was the descriptions of the culture of the colonies, which from the 19th century onwards were never objective, as the Western researchers' slander was already sufficient. The yellow and black races needed to be held in check, as their activities dragged the world back into antiquity, being unable to comprehend the ideals that led humanity to further development. From that time onwards, both the French and the English began to measure different representatives of the earth according to the parameters of their skulls and bodies, the color of their hair, skin, and eyes, their predominant physiological, psychological, and cognitive characteristics, thus giving birth to a new branch of anthropology, the science of the peculiarities of humanity within the rest of the fauna, bracology. During the First World War, Germany gained popularity with the Scientific Society of Thule, which pointed out that it was precisely these Aryans that all the European myth-making, from the myths of the ancient Greeks to the myths of the ancient Germans themselves, who, together with the Celts and Romans, formed the Western Europeans, referred to. The Eastern Europeans were considered part of Asia, as the people of antiquity thought, particularly Tartari. The heads of most Slavs, Hungarians and Lapps were recognized as being closer to the Asians. Such were the works of the German professors from Thule. The theory of the racial hierarchy of Gobineau, the philosophy of Nietzsche about the necessity of the calling of the supermen as masters, as well as the works of the Society Honor, which used even esoteric knowledge to prove the Aryans, became the foundation of the ideology of the German National Socialists. In 1918, the indecisiveness of the German nation in the matter of capturing the whole world led to the nation of the Aryans, the people of Germany, Denmark, the Scandinavian peninsula, and the adjacent islands being recognized as the most pure-blooded among the other Nordics, to which the white population that had conquered most of the world belonged. The northern half of the Western Europeans understood only the west of their continent, but already on other continents as well. In 1920, after 12 years of realizing poverty and all kinds of offenses from other Europeans, these German radicals united into a single party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which consisted of workers, military personnel, and intellectuals, who were precisely those who spread the main headquarters of the party. Of course, the party was located in Germany itself, and here, due to the historical situation, there were more people who spoke German. Life in Germany continued to worsen, and these radicals constantly took advantage of this, calling for a review of the outcomes of the First World War, the return of the lost territories, and then the capture of all power on the earth, so that the super race would take everything away from the subhumans. At the same time, a part of the Italians recognized themselves as the descendants of the Roman Empire, the supporters of Mussolini, or the fascists, and a part of the Spaniards recognized themselves as the descendants of the Spanish Empire, which was partially reduced by the scoundrels, the British. The supporters of Franco, or the Phalangists, also engaged in anthropometry in ways to get more white people and less non-white people, who were quite swarthy. There was no point in measuring people with eugenics. From 1932 to 1933, armed members of the NSDAP and those who sympathized with them finally gained power in Germany, and the people chose Hitler, who was strongly poisoned and moreover Austrian, as their leader. The works of the Society RB, which were based on the research of the Society of Thule, became the officially recognized doctrine of the new empire of all German-speaking countries, the Third Reich. People began to be forcibly measured from 1933, first in Germany, and then as the empire expanded in other countries as well. There was a memorandum with a drawing of the appearance of the UNR. In the Hitlerian state, eugenics reached its peak, and it began to filter not only the European race, but also the Semites and the Gypsies, who are also related to it, and even the Nordics, among whom people with genetic diseases were found. According to the Nazi eugenic policy, those who were considered unworthy of life were to be destroyed, and these included prisoners, the underdeveloped opponents of the regime, and those with congenital cognitive and physical impairments. The mentally handicapped were actually one of the main reasons for forced sterilization, which was carried out on people who received the status of unworthy of life from the medics. Those who looked like them were also sterilized. It was impossible to hide one's medical status, and these people were simply destroyed without hesitation. However, the murder of the mentally ill whether through lobotomy or electric shock, had already been demonstrated to the world by the Anglo-Saxons, under the guise of treating them in British and American insane asylums. Research in the Russian Empire and the USSR, the teachings of selection infected the scientific minds of all countries, so it would be foolish to assume that there was no eugenic community in the Russian Empire. It should be remembered that there was a Black Hundred there, to which this idea appealed. However, the Soviet authorities were more attracted to positive eugenics. While the first Soviet intellectuals were writing articles about the fact that intelligence is inherited, Stalin, on the contrary, condemned such an obviously bourgeois hypothesis, which did not correspond to the ideology of socialism. He immediately translated the beginnings of Russian eugenics from the bourgeois negative version into the positive one. The first Soviet eugenicists received it even for those who engaged in purely practical medical experiments. That is, genetics was already recognized as pseudoscience. Soviet eugenics, in defiance of the bourgeois world, was limited to the methods of Makarenko, and Soviet Untermenschen were determined not by their appearance, but by their hooligan behavior, and then they were re-educated through labor. During the transition of some Cossacks to the side of the Reich occupiers, it turned out that these ideological heirs of the Black Hundreds and ardent fans of eugenics were the ones who created the apartheid regime in South Africa. What is now almost impossible to imagine in South Africa. Do you think that some allies in the Second World War understood, on the German example, the fact that racism is bad? Not quite. In Belgium, as early as 1958, Black people were exhibited in cages as zoo exhibits, and the British, having conquered the country of the Boers in 1899, cynically presented themselves to the Africans as their saviors from the racists, the Boers, and introduced the apartheid regime into the future South Africa. At its core was, again, eugenics. It was necessary to ensure that the Kafirs were as quickly as possible placed in ghetto-like conditions, with restrictions on their right to medicine, decent work, and education. Only the descendants of British colonizers could be rich, while the Boers occupied middle positions and army posts. Half-breeds from the Xhosa and Ulus could be qualified workers or some kind of controllers. Full-blooded Xhosa or Zulus were measured by the shape of their skulls, the color of their skin, and the curliness of their hair. The curlier the hair and the darker the skin, the fewer hopes they had of finding work, even as unskilled laborers, including in harmful occupations, such as cleaners and garbage collectors. The basis of apartheid, or apart-hate, as it was originally called, that is, coast for all except whites, lay in the fact that Africa and the whites, the descendants of the British, were secretly poisoned with the most dangerous chemicals and viruses from the secret biolaboratories of the special services. These viruses later became the cause of dozens of different pandemics for a long time, and even now they continue in Africa. Each variety of the population had a pass system. The current South African government is divided into two isolated territories within these strange states. Everything was divided into zones, with separate residential areas, shops, places of work, and hospitals for people of at least 4 different varieties. It was possible to survive until 1992 to 1994, simply by fighting for their rights and with the condemning resonance from the outside. Finally, the completely exhausted pseudoscience today. Liberal eugenics is a scientific field that supports the improvement of human qualities and capabilities through the implementation of reproductive technologies and genetic engineering. Its key concept is the optimization of the genetic background of future generations, reducing the prevalence of genetic diseases and other undesirable characteristics. Its representatives, the adepts and fanatics of any religion, consider the modern eugenicists of our time, as well as their predecessors, racists, who continue to correct the work of the Creator. There is genetic engineering. With the help of genetic screening, it is possible to reduce the risk of spreading dangerous diseases, and gene therapy provides the opportunity to treat such ailments as diabetes, anemia, and certain types of cancer. And there is the concept of individualization, which allows for the changing of physiological and psychological characteristics. At the origins of this type of scientific eugenic movement is a group of 20 scientists from several Western countries, whose activities were lobbied for the recognition of rights and freedoms, but only in a strictly regulated form. This same principle touched all the sciences. The free flight of scientific thought is good, but it is necessary to encourage only those researchers whose flight brings the maximum benefit to society. In this way, genetics received an order from Western society to fight with disability and ugliness. In 1973, it was possible for the first time to separate the simplest particles of what is called the genome, the set of hereditary material. For the first time, genetic material became relatively accessible as a constructor, and different elements of it can be cut off and attached. At present, the supporters of eugenics have online resources that are not subject to blocking, and the What do you think about it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion is very important to me. Don't forget to give me a like if you liked it and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.